The October sun hung low over Utah's Red Canyon walls in 1976, casting long shadows across the desert floor like skeletal fingers reaching towards some unseen truth. Jack Morrison had been hiking these remote trails for 15 years, seeking solitude among the ancient stone formations that rose from the earth like silent sentinels. The crunch of his boots against dried sage and loose gravel was the only sound for miles until something else caught his attention. A metallic glint reflecting the dying light. He approached the anomaly slowly, his weathered hands brushing away decades of accumulated sand and debris. What emerged beneath his careful excavation defied explanation, a crude altar constructed from stacked desert stones, their surfaces worn smooth by wind and time. But it was not the primitive architecture that made his breath catch in his throat. Arranged with deliberate precision across the altar's flat surface were items that had no place in this barren wilderness. A small pink hair ribbon, its edges frayed but colour still vibrant. A child's leather shoe, size 6, with a brass buckle that caught the fading sunlight. 2 matching wooden dolls, their painted faces worn nearly smooth, positioned as if sleeping peacefully side by side. Each object spoke of innocence, lost of lives interrupted in the most final way imaginable. In the autumn of 1976, the quiet desert community of Cedar Ridge was unsettled by the discovery of this macabre shrine. Jack Morrison had stumbled upon something that had waited 20 years to be found, leaving behind only these cryptic remnants of childhood. But when Detective Ray Hoffman would arrive to investigate this mysterious altar, he would uncover a truth so devastating it would unravel the very fabric of multiple lives and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. As Jack Morrison backed away from the altar, his hands trembling as he reached for his radio, he could not have known that this moment would resurrect a case that had haunted Cedar Ridge since the summer of 1956. The desert had kept its secrets well, but now the stones would speak, and their testimony would reveal that evil had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades, wearing the mask of ordinary community life. The real journey was just beginning, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a killer was about to discover that time had finally run out. The Desert Springs spiritual retreat had welcomed the Fletcher family with open arms during that sweltering summer of 1956. Nestled in a natural basin surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs, the retreat promised spiritual renewal and escape from the chaos of modern life. Canvas tents dotted the grounds in neat rows, their white peaks gleaming against the rust-coloured landscape like a mirage of hope in the wilderness. Emma and Sarah Fletcher, identical twins with cornflower blue eyes and matching braids, had adapted to the retreat's rhythms with the effortless grace of 7-year-olds. They rose each morning at dawn for meditation, their small voices joining the adult chorus in hymns that echoed off the canyon walls. Their mother Helen had brought them here, seeking answers to questions she never voiced aloud, while their father remained back in Cedar Ridge, tending to his hardware store and trusting his wife's spiritual instincts. On the morning of July 15th, Brother Marcus led his usual group of children on their daily nature walk. A gentle man in his 30s, with prematurely grey hair and soft brown eyes, he had earned the trust of every family at the retreat through his patient guidance and genuine affection for the young souls in his care. The children followed him single file along the narrow trail that wound between juniper bushes and weathered boulders, their laughter mixing with the morning songs of desert wrens. Emma walked directly behind Brother Marcus, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch interesting rocks or dried flowers they passed. Sarah brought up the rear, her habit of lagging behind to examine beetles and lizards well known to the other children. The trail followed an ancient creek bed, long since dried to cracked earth and scattered stones that crunched beneath their feet. When Brother Marcus reached the designated turnaround point, a distinctive red rock formation the children had nicknamed the Sleeping Giant. He counted heads as he always did. 8 children had started the walk. Only 6 stood before him now, their faces tilted upward in the growing heat, waiting for permission to return to camp for breakfast. Emma and Sarah Fletcher had vanished without a sound, without a cry, without leaving so much as a footprint in the hard-packed desert soil behind them. Brother Marcus stood frozen at the turnaround point, his weathered hands trembling as he recounted the remaining children for the 3rd time. The desert heat pressed against his back like an accusation, and sweat began to bead along his hairline despite the early hour. 6 pairs of young eyes stared up at him, confusion replacing their usual morning joy, as they sensed something had gone terribly wrong. "Stay together," he commanded, his voice hoarser than usual. "Nobody moves from this spot." His eyes swept the barren landscape, searching for any sign of movement, any flash of the twins' matching yellow dresses against the muted browns and reds of the canyon walls. The silence felt alive, pressing against his eardrums with the weight of possibility and dread. He retraced their steps with methodical precision, his gaze scanning every depression in the earth, every cluster of sagebrush large enough to conceal a child. The other children followed at a distance, their chatter replaced by an unnatural quiet that made every footstep seem amplified. Brother Marcus called their names until his throat grew raw, his voice echoing off the stone formations and returning empty. When they finally reached the retreat, Brother Marcus's face had taken on the grey pallor of a man who had glimpsed his own mortality. He sent the remaining children to their parents and immediately organised search parties, his usual gentle demeanour replaced by something desperate and driven. For 3 days he barely slept, barely ate, leading groups of volunteers deeper into the maze of canyons than any of them had ever ventured. On the 4th night, retreat founder Ezra Whitmore found Brother Marcus sitting alone beside the cold ashes of a search campfire, staring into the darkness with eyes that had seen too much. His clothes were torn from scrambling over rocks, his hands bloodied from moving stones that might have concealed small bodies. "They trusted me," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the night wind. "Their mother put them in my care, and I failed them." He looked up at Whitmore with an expression that would haunt the older man for years. What kind of shepherd loses his lambs in the wilderness? The question hung in the desert air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Detective Ray Hoffman arrived at the Desert Springs retreat on the 5th day, when hope had curdled into something darker and more desperate. A lean man with steel grey hair and eyes that had seen too many tragedies, he carried himself with the measured gait of someone who understood that answers rarely came easily. The retreat's white tents now seemed less like symbols of spiritual seeking and more like grave markers dotting the desert floor. He found Helen Fletcher sitting alone in the communal prayer tent, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. She had not joined the search parties, had not wept openly like the other mothers might have. Instead, she maintained a composure that struck Hoffman as either remarkably strong or deeply disturbing. Her blonde hair remained perfectly arranged despite the desert wind, and her blue dress showed no signs of the dust that coated everything else in this place. "Mrs. Fletcher," Hoffman said gently, settling onto the wooden bench across from her, "I need to ask you some questions about Emma and Sarah." Helen's pale eyes met his without flinching.
"And then they were not."
"They were chosen," she said simply, as if stating an obvious fact about the weather. "I knew from the moment they were born that they were special. Twins carry divine purpose, detective. Ancient peoples understood this." Hoffman felt the first prickle of unease crawl up his spine. "Chosen for what, Mrs. Fletcher?" for something greater than this world offers." Her voice remained eerily calm, almost dreamy. "I brought them here because I felt the calling. Ezra's teachings about spiritual transformation, about transcending earthly attachments. It all made sense when I held my daughters for the first time." The detective leaned forward slightly, studying the woman's serene expression. Outside, he could hear the distant voices of searchers calling the twins' names, their desperation carrying on the desert wind. Inside the tent, Helen Fletcher sat like a statue of maternal acceptance, speaking of her missing children as if they had simply graduated to some higher plane of existence. "Do you believe your daughters are still alive, Mrs. Fletcher?" Helen smiled then, and the expression chilled Hoffman more than her previous composure. "Death is just another doorway, detective. My girls have walked through it into something beautiful." Detective Hoffman's investigation into Ezra Whitmore began with a simple records check that quickly revealed disturbing patterns spanning 2 decades. The retreat founder had established similar spiritual communities in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, each lasting 3 to 5 years, before quietly dissolving amid whispered concerns from local authorities. The official reasons varied: financial difficulties, permit issues, internal disputes, but Hoffman noticed something else in the scattered reports. Children had gone missing from or near each of Whitmore's previous retreats. Not many, never enough to establish a clear pattern that might have drawn federal attention. A 6-year-old girl who wandered away during a camping trip in Arizona, 1948. Twin boys who disappeared from a New Mexico commune in 1951. A 7-year-old who vanished from a Nevada spiritual gathering in 1953. Each case had been handled by different jurisdictions. Each had been classified as accidental deaths or runaways, and each had occurred just months before Whitmore's community mysteriously disbanded. Hoffman found Whitmore in the retreat's main lodge, a tall man in his 60s with shoulder-length grey hair and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the detective's appearance. He wore simple brown robes and leather sandals, his movements deliberate and almost ceremonial as he prepared herbal tea with practiced hands. "Detective," Whitmore said, without looking up from the steaming kettle, "I've been expecting you. The desert speaks to those who know how to listen, and it has been whispering of judgment approaching." The scent of sage and something sweeter filled the lodge's dim interior. Hoffman noted the walls covered with handwritten prayers, children's drawings, and photographs of past retreat attendees, dozens of young faces smiling from the shadows. Many of the photos showed children who appeared to be around the same age as the Fletcher twins. "I understand you've run similar retreats in other states," Hoffman said, accepting the offered cup but not drinking. The tea's herbal aroma carried an undertone he couldn't identify, something that reminded him, unpleasantly, of funeral flowers. Whitmore's smile was serene and untroubled. "Spiritual work requires movement. Detective, we go where we're called, and we leave when our purpose is fulfilled. The desert has taught me that all things have their season, including the children who pass through our care." The way he said "pass through" made Hoffman's hand instinctively move toward his service weapon. The Cedar Ridge Public Library occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, its narrow windows filtering afternoon sunlight through dusty glass. Detective Hoffman had come seeking newspaper archives, hoping to trace Ezra Whitmore's movements across the Southwest more precisely than scattered police reports allowed. The building smelled of old paper and binding glue, familiar scents that reminded him of childhood afternoons spent escaping into adventure stories. Margaret Coyne emerged from behind the reference desk, like a shadow gaining substance. A woman in her 40s with mousy brown hair pinned back in a practical bun, she wore wire-rimmed glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes, and a cardigan despite the desert heat outside. Her movements were economical and precise as she guided Hoffman toward the periodical section in the library's rear corner. "I remember when the Fletcher girls went missing," she said quietly, her fingers trailing along the spine of a bound newspaper volume. "Such a tragedy. I was only in my 20s then, but I helped organize some of the initial search efforts. Everyone in town was affected." Hoffman watched as she efficiently pulled specific volumes from the shelves, her selections revealing an intimate knowledge of which publications might contain relevant information. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years cataloguing human suffering, her touch gentle against the yellowed pages as she opened each volume to precisely the right date. "Ezra Whitmore troubled me from the start," Margaret continued, adjusting her glasses as she located a relevant article. "There was something in his eyes during the search. Most people showed desperation or grief, but he seemed almost expectant, as if he knew something the rest of us didn't." She pointed to a photograph accompanying a 1956 article about the twins' disappearance. Whitmore stood among a group of searchers, his face partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. But Margaret was right. There was something unsettling about his expression, a calm that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. "I've always been good at reading people," Margaret said softly, her fingertips hovering over Whitmore's image. "It's a skill that serves librarians well. People often reveal more than they intend when they're seeking information." She looked up at Hoffman with those magnified blue eyes. "Sometimes the most dangerous ones are those who appear most helpful." Detective Hoffman's investigation took a disturbing turn when he discovered Brother Marcus's personal quarters had been searched by retreat staff immediately after the twins' disappearance. Ezra Whitmore claimed it was routine procedure, but the hastiness of the action and the suspicious disposal of several personal items raised questions that had never been properly addressed by the original investigation. Margaret Coyne had suggested Hoffman speak with Ruth Hensley, a former retreat member who had left Desert Springs abruptly just weeks before the Fletcher twins vanished. Ruth now lived in a small apartment above the Cedar Ridge General Store, her face bearing the premature lines of someone who had carried secrets too long. When she opened her door to find the detective waiting, her hands immediately began to tremble. "I should have spoken up 20 years ago," Ruth whispered, ushering Hoffman inside with nervous glances toward the street below. The apartment was sparse and clean, decorated only with religious imagery and a single photograph of a young girl with dark hair. "But who would have believed me Brother Marcus was everyone's favorite?" She explained how she had witnessed inappropriate meetings between Brother Marcus and several of the older children at the retreat late-night encounters in the prayer tent that violated every principle of the spiritual community. Ruth described seeing him give special gifts to certain children, carved wooden animals, extra sweets, small privileges that marked them as his particular favorites. "Emma and Sarah were always together," Ruth continued, wringing her hands as she spoke. "But I saw him trying to separate them during the last few days before they disappeared. He would ask Sarah to help with one task while sending Emma on another errand. It wasn't normal behavior, Detective. It felt calculated." According to Ruth's testimony, Brother Marcus had shown increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the twins' disappearance. He had begun conducting private prayer sessions with select children, claiming they needed special spiritual guidance. He had also been observed walking the canyon trails alone after dark, sometimes carrying items that he buried in locations only he knew. The most damaging revelation came when Ruth produced a letter she had intercepted written in Brother Marcus's distinctive handwriting and addressed to someone named My Dearest Charlotte. The letter spoke of transcendent love and souls too pure for this earthly realm language that could be interpreted as either mystical devotion or something far more sinister. The search warrant for the Fletcher residence arrived on a Tuesday morning, 20 years and 3 months after Emma and Sarah had vanished into the desert heat. Helen Fletcher had returned to Cedar Ridge after the failed search, moving into her deceased mother's house on Elm Street with the mechanical precision of someone sleepwalking through grief. Detective Hoffman approached the modest 2-story home with 2 deputies, noting how the flower boxes had gone untended for years, their contents now reduced to brittle stems and dust. Helen answered the door wearing the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the original investigation. Her hair was now silver white, but her pale blue eyes held the same unsettling calm that had disturbed Hoffman decades earlier. She stepped aside without protest as the officers entered her movements, suggesting she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. The house's main floor revealed nothing unusual sparse furniture, religious texts arranged with military precision, and a kitchen that appeared rarely used. But Deputy Martinez discovered something troubling when he tested the locked door beneath the main staircase. Helen claimed it was simply storage space, but the new deadbolt and heavy-duty hinges suggested more deliberate security measures. Behind that door lay a shrine that defied rational explanation. The basement room had been painted entirely black, its walls covered with symbols that seemed to blend Christian iconography with something older and more primitive. Dozens of photographs of Emma and Sarah covered every available surface images, capturing them from infancy through their final weeks alive. Some photos showed the twins sleeping, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been standing over their beds in darkness. At the room's center stood an altar constructed from rough-hewn wood, its surface stained with what appeared to be dried blood. 2 child-sized mannequins sat upon the altar dressed in yellow dresses, identical to those the twins had worn on their final morning. Their porcelain faces had been painted to match Emma and Sarah's features with disturbing accuracy down to the small birthmark above Sarah's left eyebrow. Most chilling were the dozens of journals stacked beneath the altar, each filled with Helen's spidery handwriting. Page after page detailed her communications with divine voices that had instructed her in the sacred preparation of her daughters. The final entry, dated July 14th, 1956, contained a single line, "Tomorrow they will be made eternal." Detective Hoffman stood in that underground temple to maternal madness-breathing air, thick with incense and decay, and wondered how they had missed such obvious signs of mental breakdown. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived from the State Crime Lab on a Wednesday morning, her equipment cases rattling in the back of her dusty sedan as she navigated the rough desert roads leading to Jack Morrison's discovery site. A forensic archaeologist with 20 years of experience dating historical sites, she approached the crude stone altar with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reading stories written in soil and stone. Detective Hoffman watched as Dr. Chen carefully photographed each element of the altar from multiple angles before beginning her analysis. She scraped samples of mortar from between the stones, collected fragments of the decaying fabric that had once secured the children's belongings, and used specialized tools to measure the weathering patterns on the altar's exposed surfaces. "This is fascinating," Dr. Chen murmured as she examined her preliminary findings through a magnifying glass. "Detective, you need to see this." She pointed to the junction where 2 large stones met at the altar's base. This mortar contains Portland cement, which creates a distinctive crystalline structure when it cures. Based on the formation patterns I'm seeing, this binding agent is no more than 5 years old. Hoffman felt his blood chill as the implications sank in. "You're saying someone built this altar in the early 1970s. More than that." Dr. Chen continued moving to examine the arrangement of personal items. "Look at the preservation state of these objects. This hair ribbon should have completely deteriorated after 20 years of desert exposure, but it shows signs of recent replacement. Same with the wooden dolls. The paint loss patterns suggest they've been periodically refreshed to maintain their appearance. The revelation hit Hoffman like a physical blow. Someone had been maintaining this macabre memorial for years, carefully tending to it like a garden of grief. Someone who knew intimate details about the Fletcher twins' disappearance. Someone who had access to items that matched their personal belongings with unsettling accuracy. Margaret Coyne arrived just as Dr. Chen finished her initial assessment, claiming she had come to check on the investigation's progress and offer any additional assistance from the library's archives. She approached the altar with the same careful reverence she showed toward fragile historical documents, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "How troubling," she said, softly adjusting her cardigan against the desert wind. "To think someone has been coming here all these years preserving this monument to tragedy." She paused, her gaze lingering on the wooden dolls. "It suggests a very disturbed individual, doesn't it? Someone with an obsessive attachment to the case." As Dr. Chen packed her equipment, Detective Hoffman found himself studying Margaret Coyne with growing unease. Something about her presence at the crime scene felt orchestrated, as if she had anticipated exactly when and where her expertise might be needed. The helpful librarian stood near the altar's eastern edge, her fingers absently straightening the pink hair ribbon that Dr. Chen had carefully repositioned after sampling. "You mentioned organizing search efforts in 1956, Hoffman said casually, moving closer to where Margaret stood. "That must have been difficult, being so young and seeing the community torn apart like that." Margaret nodded, her pale eyes fixed on the wooden dolls. "I was 26 then, just starting my career at the library. Emma always preferred the fairy tale section, while Sarah gravitated toward books about animals. Such different personalities despite being twins." She paused, a wistful smile crossing her face. "Emma had this habit of braiding dandelion stems when she was concentrating on a story, and Sarah would make these little humming sounds when she found a book about horses." Detective Hoffman felt ice crystallize in his veins. The Fletcher family had been members of a desert spiritual retreat, not regular library patrons. The twins had lived in Cedar Ridge for only 6 weeks before their disappearance, arriving with their mother just in time for the retreat's summer session. There would have been no opportunity for a young librarian to observe such intimate behavioral details about children who spent their days in the wilderness, following Brother Marcus on nature walks and attending prayer sessions. "Mrs. Coyne," Hoffman said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, "how exactly did you come to know the Fletcher twins so well? Their mother brought them to town specifically for the retreat. I don't have any record of them visiting the library." Margaret's hand froze on the ribbon, her magnified eyes blinking rapidly behind her glasses. For just a moment, her helpful librarian facade cracked, revealing something calculating and cold underneath. Then she recovered, smoothing her cardigan with practiced movements. "Oh my," she said with a nervous laugh. "I suppose I'm confusing them with other children. After 40 years of working with young people, the memories tend to blend together sometimes." But her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before, and she took a careful step back from both the altar and the detective. Hoffman's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. After 20 years, he was finally looking at the person who knew exactly what had happened to Emma and Sarah Fletcher. Margaret Coyne stood perfectly still beside the stone altar, her librarian's mask finally dissolving like morning mist in the desert heat. Detective Hoffman watched as 40 years of careful performance collapsed, revealing the calculating predator who had hidden beneath the surface of community respectability. Her pale blue eyes, no longer magnified by the helpful squint of concentration, fixed on him with the cold assessment of someone who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. "You have to understand," she said quietly, her voice losing its nervous flutter and taking on an almost professorial tone. "They were perfect specimens. Emma and Sarah represented childhood innocence in its purest form, untouched by the cynicism that poisons older children, unmarked by the compromises that come with growing up. Hoffman keyed his radio silently, requesting backup while keeping his eyes locked on Margaret's transformed face. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the helpful librarian who had guided his research just days earlier. This was someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing invisible, of being so thoroughly unremarkable that suspicion slid past her like water off glass. I followed them that morning. Margaret continued, her hands now steady as they rested on the altar's edge. Brother Marcus made it so easy, really. His attention was always scattered among too many children, too many responsibilities. All I had to do was wait for the right moment when the group spread out along the trail. The confession poured out of her with the relief of someone finally sharing a masterwork that had been hidden too long. She described how she had called to the twins from behind a cluster of boulders, claiming their mother needed them back at camp immediately. How Emma and Sarah had followed her trustingly into a narrow canyon where her car waited on a forgotten mining road. "I kept them safe," Margaret said, her voice taking on the dreamy quality Hoffman had heard in Helen Fletcher's speech 2 decades earlier. "In my special place beneath the library where no one could hurt them or change them or make them grow up into something disappointing. They stayed 7 years old forever, Detective. Isn't that beautiful?" The horror of her words settled over the desert like a physical weight. Somewhere beneath Cedar Ridge's public library, Margaret Coyne had been practicing her own twisted form of preservation for 20 years, and the Fletcher twins had been her first successful experiment in stopping time itself. "How many others?" Hoffman whispered, though he already dreaded the answer. Margaret smiled with genuine pride. 17 over the years, all perfect, all eternal. The excavation beneath Cedar Ridge Public Library took 3 days and revealed the full scope of Margaret Coyne's 20-year reign of calculated horror. Detective Hoffman stood in the makeshift command center as forensic teams brought up evidence from the hidden chambers Margaret had constructed in the building's forgotten sub-basement. 17 sets of small bones, each carefully preserved and arranged in individual alcoves, like some twisted museum exhibit of stolen childhoods. Margaret had confessed to everything with the methodical precision of a scholar presenting research findings. She detailed how she had moved from state to state, always securing employment in libraries or schools where she could observe potential victims. How she had researched each community's children with the same thoroughness she brought to academic inquiries, identifying those whose disappearances might be attributed to accidents or runaways. The Fletcher twins had been her masterpiece, the case that taught her how to perfect her methods. Their disappearance from a spiritual retreat had provided the ideal cover, a chaotic environment with multiple suspects and an isolated location where screams would never be heard. Brother Marcus and Helen Fletcher had unknowingly served as perfect red herrings, their genuine grief and suspicious behaviors deflecting attention from the quiet librarian who asked thoughtful questions and offered helpful assistance, as teams from multiple state agencies coordinated the massive investigation into Margaret's crimes across the Southwest. Hoffman found himself standing once more beside the stone altar where this final chapter had begun. Dr. Chen had confirmed that Margaret had built and maintained this memorial as a monument to her first success, returning periodically to tend the site like a gardener, nurturing some grotesque flower. The desert wind carried the voices of searchers and investigators, the sounds of justice finally catching up to decades of hidden evil. Margaret Coyne sat in a patrol car nearby, her helpful librarian persona completely abandoned, as she stared through the window with the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had finally received proper recognition. As they prepared to transport Margaret to face federal charges, Detective Hoffman looked at the stone altar one last time. The real journey was just beginning, for the families who would finally learn the fate of their missing children, for a community forced to confront how thoroughly they had been deceived. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but truth endures, and justice, however delayed, eventually finds its way home. As he walked toward his vehicle, Hoffman felt the weight of 20 years lifting from his shoulders. "Sometimes the answers take longer than we'd like," he murmured to the desert wind. The investigation was far from over, but the children could finally rest. He stepped toward the difficult work ahead, toward healing a community would build one painful truth at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.